All right, students, today we are finishing up our unit on the Gilded Age with one more lesson. It's social issues of the Gilded Age. We'll talk about a couple of different particular ways of viewing society and how both the rich and the poor viewed society, the society that they lived in during the Gilded Age, and how they went about trying to fix that. So we're going to begin today with a little starter activity. So here are the questions that we want to start with today. I want you to consider the following these, and I'm going to give you a little bit of time to answer them in a second, but just think about these and think about your own experiences and how they shape your opinion for these. First off, number one, do you think that in our society, anyone can escape poverty by working hard and applying themselves? Number two, what obstacles are there in improving social status or wealth in our society? And number three, should the government provide help or aid to help those in poverty climb the social ladder? If so, what kind of help should they provide? So take a minute to answer those questions and we'll come back here to discuss in just a moment. Certainly for your answers for all of these questions, your own personal experiences probably shaped a lot of how you feel about these things, as well as perhaps some of the opinions of parents or family or others, and as well as could be shaped by some of the media that you consume as well. But these are important questions because it's all about social mobility and our ability to be able to navigate the difficulties or the economic difficulties of society. And our belief in, do we have a fair society or an equal society where people can, if they really work hard to apply themselves, can they really climb the social ladder? So these are really important questions, and questions that people would not agree with if we were to talk about it with just about any small group of people. So whether you think that anyone can escape poverty by working hard and applying themselves, we can see examples of why you might believe that that's true, why not. So what obstacles are there in improving social status or wealth in our society? You might have listed obstacles like the difficulty of being able to find work or find sustainable work, or to get fair pay for the work that you do. You may have put kind of in that category the difficulty of somebody in poverty to be able to find a job, to be able to get loans, to be able to open bank accounts, to be able to do to be able to get a car or have a car that they can be reliable transportation for them. Family structure can sometimes be an obstacle, and and the need to care for other members of the family can sometimes make that a difficult transition for some people. So there's lots and lots of obstacles that we could list. Now, it's certainly an opinion, should the government help provide aid or not? That's always something very debatable, and we could argue about that for quite some time, and people have a different concept of how much aid or that the government should provide. But when we talk about government aid, we're talking about everything from like Social Security to Medicare and Medicaid, so health insurance, food stamps, all of those kinds of things would fall under that. The reason we ask is because there are there's several very different concepts of that in society during the Gilded Age, and very, very different ways of thinking. Keep in mind that there is a great diversity in the population during the Gilded Age. You have a lot of very, very poor, and you have many, not very many, but a few very, very wealthy individuals. There's a growing middle class, but it's still relatively small compared to the lower class. And so this brings about or influences a change in philosophy or thought in society called social Darwinism. Now, the idea of social Darwinism develops from Charles Darwin's original theory of evolution in The Origin of Species. You might know about Darwinism or evolution from science, and know that this is the idea that organisms or animals over long periods of time, thousands and thousands of years, developed or evolved to their environment to better provide for their needs. So a great example of Darwin's theory of evolution applied might be something like maybe giraffes originally had just looked kind of like horses and had normal sized necks. But because giraffes eat from leaves high up in the trees, those with the longest necks seem to be better fed and seem to exist in society and survive in society a little bit better. And so those longer necked giraffes procreated with other long necked giraffes, procreated with others, and they made more long necked giraffes. And gradually, then over hundreds or thousands of years, giraffes' necks became longer and longer and longer until they are today, because that was most beneficial for their species, and those are the ones that survived the best and procreated and made new species. So that would be an example of Darwin's idea of what evolution looked like. So this was certainly popular at the beginning of the Gilded Age, but somebody takes that idea and applies it a little bit differently. They apply it to the same concept to social class and social mobility. The idea behind Darwin's idea was that those strongest in society are the ones that will thrive and survive. And somebody took that and said that's probably also true for humans in society. And they call this, the name of the person that does this is Herbert Spencer, and he calls this the survival of the fittest. In other words, those that are most capable, most talented, most likely to succeed are going to be the ones that succeed in society. And others just aren't really made to cut it, and they kind of die off, and so we find that we have a survival of the fittest. Now, you can already think, if you're thinking about society and who believes in this kind of idea of social Darwinism, you probably can already guess what sector of society believes in this. This is definitely going to be the wealthy, because they can look around and they can look at their surroundings and be like, hey, look me, I'm wealthy. I must be among the fittest and most capable in society because I'm wealthy. And the poor, well, they're poor and they're impoverished for a reason, because they don't really have the capability to survive in society. So kind of central to this idea of social Darwinism are a couple of things. That anybody can be a self-made man. Anybody who is born into poverty or has very little opportunity or wealth can, if they work hard and really apply themselves and educate themselves and want to achieve, that they can work their way up the social ladder and turn into something and make something of themselves. It doesn't matter the obstacles that are before them. If they really want to, anybody can succeed in society. Somebody like Andrew Carnegie would really subscribe to this idea, because remember how he started poor and then just kind of worked his way up through society and said, well, the reason I did is because I was smart and was able to apply myself, and hey, the strong survive. That's who makes it in society. So the idea of self-made man really plays into this social Darwinistic theory. Also, and same kind of line, this means that this rags to riches dream that some people have is possible. That you can start with nothing and you can get very, very wealthy if you work hard, apply yourself, and are intelligent, and do all those things. Also, at the center of all this is this belief in hard work. And they look at people that are impoverished and say, well, if they would just work harder, if they would just apply themselves, if they were just a little bit smarter with their money, or all of those things, that they would be able to be like me, or they would be able to be more wealthy, or whatever. So that idea pervades society as well, that hard work is the principal ingredient needed to be successful. And the reason that some people are not is because they just don't have that. They either don't have the hard work or they don't have the intelligence to do it. So social Darwinism is a pretty harsh kind of belief or philosophy, but you can see why the wealthy or the well-to-do in American society would embrace that idea, because it sort of proves themselves, and it proves that to them that they deserve to be where they are. Okay, some great examples of social Darwinism in society during this time are these novels by a guy by the name of Horatio Alger. And Horatio writes, you can tell by the titles, Strive and Succeed, Sink or Swim. It's these things that people would read, and it would basically always be this rags to riches story where this young boy or this young person down on their luck goes to the city and doesn't look like they're going to make it, but they work hard and they really apply themselves, and through good fortune and good gritty hard work, they make it and they turn into this huge success story. That's kind of like he wrote bunches of novels, but that's basically the premise to every single one. It's the same, and it would always be the same and always work out. And it just kind of perpetuated this idea in society that social Darwinism is true, that anybody that wanted to climb the social ladder, all they had to do was just apply themselves and work hard. Okay, so people read these, they drank the Kool-Aid, they believed in it, and that was their thing. They're like, yeah, this could totally happen, right? Another idea that supports this is a book that Andrew Carnegie himself wrote. It's called The Gospel of Wealth. It isn't so much of as a whole book, is more of kind of an essay. But in his Gospel of Wealth, he basically says and argues the fact that he has a lot of money because he knows what to do with money, and he's very responsible, and that it's just kind of, he was destined to have that kind of money so that he could help other people, and and do well with it. The people that don't have much money in society are not very capable of handling money well, and that they are just kind of destined to be street urchins who are going to do the best they can to skate by, and that's kind of their station in life. He also uses his Gospel of Wealth book to advance his idea that everybody needs to, if you have wealth, you need to give back to society, which is definitely kind of a lot better of an idea. But you can also see how the Gospel of Wealth kind of contributed to these ideas of social Darwinism as well, and how rich folks like Carnegie thought that they were rich or deserved to be rich based on these principles of social Darwinism. Okay, so this is the way some people view society, and kind of justify the way that the social structure is in America. But there are people that react a little bit differently and participate in something called the social gospel movement. And the social gospel movement takes a completely different approach to how this is done. There are some basic goals of the social gospel movement. The first is that if they can just better the conditions in cities, life is going to be better for everybody. And as the kind of the core principle behind everything they do are biblical ideas of charity and justice. So it's a religiously motivated kind of charitable effort to help people in the cities and help people, particularly poor people, climb the ladder. So they would do things that would try to aim to provide for people's needs, whether it's food, clothing, somewhere to sleep, all of those kinds of things. They wanted to reform character. In other words, if you have people that were kind of maybe resigned to a life of crime, they want to make them better people. They want to make them just better contributors to society, better citizens, everything like that. So that was part of that as well. In this case, since it's religiously motivated, they probably wanted to turn them into good Christians as well. And they wanted to assimilate them into American culture. And whenever we use the word assimilate, think about like them taking immigrants and just kind of stripping away some of their immigrant culture, making them more of that American culture as well. And so that goal in itself may not be entirely pure, but nevertheless, it's something they wanted to do. So what did this look like in practice? Well, there are a couple good examples. One of which is the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army, which you've heard of, because there's a Salvation Army in Sherman, and they've got like a Salvation Army store and things like that. But it starts as an organization that provides direct aid to people. So they need food, provided food. They need, clothes or something like that. It would help provide that. So that's kind of how it begins. It is definitely religiously based, however, and they provided services like religious counseling to help people do anything from like find jobs to just kind of function in society a little bit better and a little bit more positively. So the Salvation Army obviously is still an organization that's around today. And another similar one is the YMCA. The YMCA it stands for the Young Men's Christian Association, again, a religiously motivated organization. And they would provide citizenship training to help immigrants assimilate into society. They also provided social activities and connected people and give them an opportunity to enjoy themselves and find a reason for being. Everything from sports and things like that to dances to all kinds of different things they had through the YMCA. So those are both huge parts of the social gospel movement and advancing that as well. Something that was very specific to the time, though, was something called settlement houses. And settlement houses were aimed to provide, they were sometimes placed in the worst part of cities, or sometimes the part of cities that had seen the most immigrants come into that part of the city and had the greatest need. And what they were started primarily by educated women. In this case, women primarily, probably because most of them don't have formal work or formal jobs. They're not the breadwinners for their family, and so they have the time and opportunity. Educated implies probably also they have a little bit of wealth, so they were able to dedicate the time to it. And they put these in immigrant neighborhoods because that was perhaps one of the places of greatest need. And so these were one-stop shop kind of community centers for anything that an immigrant can need. So it could be medical care. They're injured, they need help. They would teach English at these places. A lot of times they have books and libraries, so there's this educational aspect to it. They also provided recreational programs for exercise and different things like that. It's like literally within these settlement houses, it's kind of like everything that somebody could possibly need. Sometimes they even had soup kitchens there at these settlement houses, but they were trying to provide just about anything that would help immigrants come into the country, come into the city, and be able to make it on their own. One of the best known of these settlement houses was the Hull House. That's what's shown right there in that picture. And it's in Chicago. It was started by Jane Addams. There's Jane Addams, who was a settlement house pioneer, and kind of set the pattern for other people to follow as to how do we create these settlement houses, what kind of services should we offer, and how do we provide help. So settlement houses are a big part of the social gospel movement as well. Also, we talked about kind of this social Darwinism, the way some people viewed society from the rich perspective. Then we talked about the social gospel movement, some people's desire to help and provide aid to those that are having difficulty in society. And then there's also the issue of social equality and social justice, which is just as prevalent, of course, now and then as it was then. But this becomes a huge issue, particularly after the Civil War. Right after the war, many former slaves felt stuck in the South, and it's because they were liberated from slavery, but they had no skills. They had very little education, so really all they knew was agriculture, and they didn't have the ability to really gonna go out on their own, and so they were forced into a system called sharecropping. And sharecropping was basically like slavery without the whipping and everything else like that. Sharecropping basically meant you farmed somebody else's land, and they pretty much gouged you for most of what you'd produced. It was a cycle of poverty that was hard to break, and it kind of kept many Southern blacks continually under the thumb of white landowners in the South. And so even though the Civil War had made many changes, or supposedly made changes in society based on the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, in many cases things didn't change as much as they should have. Probably one of the most significant ways in which discrimination continued in the South was that many blacks who were supposed to be able to receive the right to vote under the 15th Amendment were continually denied voting rights. And so because it was an amendment to the Constitution, they white leaders in the South had to get pretty creative in how they went about this. So they used a couple different methods to do so. And in many cases, they would charge a poll tax and basically make people pay to be able to vote, because they knew that many of the sharecroppers and free blacks would not be able to pay a poll tax in order to vote, would not be able to afford that. The only downside to this, as far as the white leaders were concerned, is that meant that they wouldn't be able to have the votes of poor white people. So they kind of had to change some things out, and so they decided they would go with something called literacy tests instead. They used literacy tests basically and said, well, in order to vote, you got to be able to have to read, or you have to pass a short test to read. Well, of course, many Southern blacks weren't able to read because they had been in slavery and hadn't been educated, and so they wouldn't be able to pass the literacy test and wouldn't be able to vote. But again, the loophole or the problem here for whites was that there was a number of uneducated Southern whites as well that couldn't read, so they were left out. So they had to try to find a new, less restricting loophole again. And this time they used something called the grandfather clause. And basically what it said was that if your grandfather was able to vote in an election, then you too, by being his descendant, you would also be able to vote. So for all our former slaves, obviously the grandfathers were not able to vote because they were under slavery, and that was not allowed at that time. But for those poor illiterate whites that otherwise couldn't vote, now they had a way that they could allow them to vote. So it was kind of like this big loophole to allow all of these poor illiterate Southern whites to vote, while you could still exclude blacks formally. All right. So there are tons of examples of things like this and continued discrimination. A lot of times we refer to this segregation and discrimination that continued to take place in the South, even though things were supposed to have changed. We call these Jim Crow laws, and that kind of preserved discrimination in our country, particularly in the South, where it became very acceptable and continually acceptable to discriminate, to segregate, and do those things. Nothing goes further to solidify this than a court case that takes place at the end of the 1800s. The name of the court case is Plessy versus Ferguson, and it's about a person named Homer Plessy. He was of mixed race, and he was riding a railroad car, and he was actually riding in the white car. And the railroad worker basically told him that, you know, you can't do this, you got to ride in the black's car, and he refused to do so. And eventually is arrested, and when he goes to court, he says, hey, this isn't fair, you know, this is there. First off, that he was of mixed race, and so he has just as much right as anybody, and that segregation was wrong. And so this goes to the Supreme Court, and he's challenging the idea of segregation. And what the Supreme Court decides really changes the course of history for a long time. It basically codifies segregation, and the Supreme Court decides segregation can and be legal as long as there are facilities or equal facilities provided for both blacks and whites. And the phrase that comes away from Plessy versus Ferguson is this idea of separate but equal. It is separate is okay as long as it is equal. And so this kind of says, it gives the stamp of approval for segregation. Now, you and I both know that it was never equal, and that segregation in itself meant inequality, because the black train cars or black water fountains or restaurants or whatever it might be rarely, if ever, were equal to that of the whites. But nevertheless, this court case paves the way. And from that point forward, if there was any kind of segregation and somebody said, hey, that's not right, all they had to do was point to this court case and say, Plessy versus Ferguson, it's okay, it's separate but equal. So basically sets the United States back a big step by codifying segregation that will take 50 years to overcome. And some of the progress of the Civil War is lost with this one court case, and the big step backward that it is. There were, however, some leaders that emerged at this time that continued the fight for civil rights and tried to advance the social causes of Black Americans. One of the most prevalent of the time was a lady by the name of Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was a journalist who wrote about the atrocity of the lynchings that were continuing to happen throughout American society, and to expose the horrors of what they were. So she would write articles talking about the statistics and some of the terrible, terrible things that happened as Black Americans were lynched throughout the South, and to bring people to an awareness of some of those ideas and some of what was happening. Also, another leader that emerges at the time is a guy by the name of Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington gives a number of relatively famous speeches, none more famous than the Atlanta Compromise, but he talks about the importance of Black Americans educating themselves and proving to white Americans that they are capable of doing the same kinds of jobs, and he believed that thereby he could gain equality as soon as whites recognized that blacks could do the same things that whites could do and are just as intelligent and educated. Somebody that kind of disagreed with Booker T. Washington because he thought his approach was a little bit weak was a guy by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois was very much opposed to Washington's theories, and he thought that you needed to continue to push for civil rights, and particularly for voting rights, because he saw the voter discrimination that was taking place, and continued to urge for Black Americans to fight for their rights. So you see a number of leaders emerge at this time also to fight for social justice and to try to advance that cause. It doesn't get much further, especially during these early 1910s, particularly based on what's going on in the South. But there's still a voice out there, and there are people that are pushing for those rights for Black Americans. All of these social changes and ideas and opinions are part of what is jumbled into this big mess we call the Gilded Age. Everything from urbanization to immigration to industrialization, everything that's involved with that, innovation, and now the cities and what's going on with that, these new political movements like populism and civil service reform, and some of the social issues that take place. It is a very interesting and difficult time for a number of Americans. And so as we come to the end of the Gilded Age, we have more problems, I think, than we have answers, more difficulties, more kinds of social unrest, all kinds of problems, and not a whole lot of answers. Society is in a pretty difficult spot in America as we come to the end of the Gilded Age. But our next chapters are going to provide some of the answers, some of the ways that America can kind of right the ship a little bit and hopefully pull themselves back on the right course. What you have now for you is to be able to prepare for that unit test over the Gilded Age. It's been a lot of material and a lot of things that we need to kind of look over. So in order to do so, you'll find a review sheet. It does go along with the text. It also has a word bank at the back of it that you will be able to use. That's there for you to be able to apply and prepare and study for the test, which will be on Friday. So get to work on that. All the answers can be found in the text. Do your best to go through there. And as you kind of go back over that and study it, I think you will find that you will be very, very prepared for the test. Good luck. Have a great day.